Hey, welcome to the Kingdoms Podcast. My name is Luke and I host this with my buddy Matt Ma. And our goal is to empower you to discover how your faith impacts culture for God's kingdom. To do that, we're sitting down with different men and women from all kinds of disciplines to uncover how they, through their ambitions and vocational skill set, make a difference in the lives of those around them. And so if this is helpful to you, we'd love it if you could like it, share it, and subscribe. In the meantime, enjoy today's episode. Well, friends, thanks a million for jumping in with us for this conversation. I'm really grateful to be joined all the way from Nashville, Tennessee, by Chris Martin. Chris, thanks for making time today, man.
Sure, glad to be here.
Chris, we were saying right before I hit record that I told my wife earlier this week, I said, Chris Martin's coming on the podcast. And she was like Coldplay, Chris Martin? And I mentioned that to you a second before we hit record on this conversation together. And you were saying when you were in grade 12, you saw them live?
Oh, yeah. So yes. Crazy, like best weekend of my life. No offense to my wife and our wedding weekend. But that was horrible for a whole other reason. Both of our houses flooded the night before our wedding because of a rainstorm, but I won't tell that story. But the best weekend of my life was the weekend I graduated from high school. I was 18. It was first weekend of June or so. And Friday night, I went and saw Coldplay in Indianapolis in VIP like box seats.
Yeah, you did.
And like got to high five the whole band as they like ran through the crowd and stuff. And it was the Viva La Vida tour, so it was like amazing. Went home, got home at like 3:00 in the morning. Graduated at 8:00 in the morning.
Oh wow!
Had graduation. Probably went to a graduation party or two that day because of graduation weekend. And then Sunday was my graduation party. It was like the most fun 3 days in a row I've ever had. It was a blast.
Well, then are you an introvert or an extrovert though?
I'm an introvert, but
how'd you?
I mean, first of all, graduation is, I was like half asleep and, it's like, I didn't really talk to anybody anyway, just like sit there for 2 hours, walk across the stage for 10 seconds and then you're done.
Hey, that's true.
But the grad party was fun because, I'd gone to so many of them and it's like fun to see all your friends and family and that kind of thing. And I don't know, it was a good time. But yeah,
people you love.
So it's a good question that why wasn't I was probably super exhausted afterward. Obviously I don't remember now. It's been a good number of years ago, but I'm sure I was pretty tapped out afterwards.
Yeah, that's fair. Dude, that's awesome though. That's a sick weekend. And yeah,
it's pretty sweet.
Like I said to you, one of my buddies was at Coldplay's, one of their concerts in Toronto back in I think it was 2019 that they were last year now. And he was like, man, that was the most spiritual experience I've had outside of worship service. Dude. So man, maybe we'll have to meet halfway between Nashville and Toronto next time they're in North America.
Yeah. It'd be like Cleveland or something. I'm trying to figure out where would that
halfway
be? I don't know.
Yeah, somewhere in Pennsylvania.
Yeah.
I don't think they'd show up at Hershey. Yeah, Philly. Philly be way more likely than anywhere else. I'll go to Philly. A lot of great history there. So
yeah.
Anyways, if you're listening in, that's why we brought you on. We want to talk to you about Coldplay. So I know we're diving in a different direction, but you may know Chris or not know a ton about Chris, but I had the chance to discover a lot about him and his work in recent months because of his writing work. He's written multiple books, and we're going to be exploring one today involving social media and its impact on our lives and how it forms us. But Chris, before stepping into that, because are you 32, Chris?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, yep. And you've written 2 books already. You're working in the whole writing, creative, editing space. And so for people who are like, if this dude isn't the Coldplay lead singer, I want to know about him. Tell me about his life. How did that passion for writing begin? Like, where did it start? And how did it take you to the place you are now as a published author?
Man, I wish we could talk about this the whole podcast because it's one of my favorite things to talk about because it has very little to do with me and very much to do with just like the influences that God put in my life all along the way.
Wow.
So I will try to keep this answer short as I know there are much like maybe deeper things to talk about, but I just really love talking about this because it's such a weird, windy road. I mean, I grew up in an elementary school that was a communications magnet school. So we had Spanish classes starting in kindergarten, but I only started there in the first grade. So I went to an all-day kindergarten because my parents were sick of me being in the house. And then I went to a first grade at this school, Croninger Elementary School in Fort Wayne, Indiana, and as a communications magnet school. So starting in first grade, we had Spanish classes every year, first through fifth grade at this elementary school.
Mhm.
And we had a TV studio class where we would go and like
Wow.
learn how a TV studio works. So like, you
Yeah.
learn how to run the control panel or learn how to run the teleprompter or be on camera and do like, broadcasts for the elementary school kind of a thing.
Mhm.
And we also had like a school newspaper, which I don't know if all elementary schools did, but I got to like be an editor in the school newspaper once I got to fifth grade. We did young authors, which in the US was like a program where every year, maybe starting in like third grade or even second grade, you like wrote a little book that like they would bind for you and things like that.
Yeah.
And so I remember enjoying a lot of those projects, even in elementary school. And then middle school, I didn't do a ton of writing. I don't have a ton of like writing memories in middle school, but man, in high school, freshman year, well, I started writing a blog when I was in eighth grade. So I guess that is the one middle school memory on Live Journal back in the
Nice.
day. And that actually still exists, and I don't give the link out because it's super embarrassing, but that blog does still exist.
But it's out there. Someone
Yeah,
can
it
find
is.
it.
It is. Good luck. And I started writing on the internet in eighth grade, I'd share the link to my MySpace page and to friends in AOL Instant Messenger.
Oh, it's beautiful.
And then my freshman year, I got into when I was going to this high school, Snyder High School. There was this English keyboarding block, is what it was called. So our school was 4 like hour-and-a-half long periods throughout the day, not 8 or whatever. And every school is different, but ours was like 4 hour-and-a-half long periods. And for freshmen, they had an honors English keyboarding block, which meant there were 30 students in one class, 30 students in the other. So 30 students would start in English, 30 students would start in typing. That's what the keyboarding class was. And then after first period, that first hour and a half, we just walk across the hall and switch. So we were kind of like one big group of 60 students that were just split up into 2 different classrooms. And so we had English class, which obviously was like writing and reading Romeo and Juliet, stuff like that. And then the keyboarding class was like teaching you how to type effectively. And it felt very weird, even in like 2005, learning how to type effectively, but it was really helpful. And like I had only learned how to type because I had a computer at my house growing up. So like, I hadn't learned like an efficient way to type. But what this resulted in was something that I kind of took for granted at the time, because I learned in college that this was very not much, very, very much so not the experience of many of my peers, even at my private Christian college. Every week as a freshman, every Friday, I had an essay due for that for the English keyboarding block. So like a 3 or 4 page essay, either reflecting on what we've been reading in class, or perhaps it was like, a persuasive essay, just various essays. As like a 14-year-old, I was writing a 3 or 4 page essay every week for the whole semester. And then I actually had English keyboarding block. They offered it for sophomores the next year. And so I did the same exact thing my sophomore year. So I wrote more my freshman and sophomore year of high school than I eventually learned that my peers had written throughout all of high school by the time I got to college.
Yeah.
So my English teacher, John Hauser, is from my freshman sophomore year of high school, is the only reason I'm able to write well today at all. Like I credit him. He was also like the linebackers coach for our football team. And so I knew him through playing football. He was very much, if anybody listening has ever watched Friday Night Lights, the TV show, he is Coach Taylor from that show. I mean, to a T. Like he is like kind of like tough as nails, but also like shows compassion, and he was an amazing teacher. He's now a principal. It makes me sad. I wish he was still in the classroom because he was just such a great teacher. But John Hauser is the only reason I'm able to write professionally at all today. He was so hard on me in a good way, because I think he could tell I wanted to write and that I was relatively good compared to maybe some of the other students in the class. But he would just push me and say, I don't like that line of thought. Like, you're not arguing well. Argue that better. Like, he would just push me really well, both in like in-class discussion. And he was like, I was kind of gathering my faith for the first time as a sophomore in high school. And he was like a pretty hardcore Catholic guy. And so we'd kind of trade punches back and forth in a kind way about various theological things and stuff. And so he just really helped me develop as a thinker and a writer. So he was a massive influence. And then I kept writing a blog throughout high school. I eventually joined a collective of like 5 other high schoolers in my town. We were all writing on one blog on WordPress at this point. WordPress had just come out, and so this was this newfangled platform.
Wow.
Yeah, and if you don't know what that is, that basically half the internet runs on WordPress, it feels like these days.
Yep.
And so, yeah, and then I wrote that blog throughout the rest of high school, got a scholarship that paid for half of my private Christian education in college, basically paid for half of my college because I was writing a blog in high school.
Which is like, just a quick heads up to people listening. If it's private Christian education, that's a good scholarship.
Yeah, let's see. So Taylor University is where I went. I think it cost
Oh, nice.
like $45,000 a year times 4. That's like almost $200,000 a year. So you could say that I got paid more for my high school blog than I've ever been paid for anything else writing in my entire life. And I've written 2 books. So
Dude,
yeah.
Yeah. Taylor is a sweet school. From what I've heard,
it's great. It's great. Christian liberal arts school. It's awesome. And so yeah, I wrote throughout high school, just like very bland, not very profound, but spiritual kind of devotional thoughts, reflections from a high school, or however profound those could have been. And then I became a Bible major in college. I was started out as an English education major, planning to teach high school English, actually. Realized pretty quickly that I wanted to do something related to ministry or Bible. So I changed my major to that. And then there's just a ton of writing involved in a Bible major.
Yeah.
Every class is centered around multiple papers. And so I did a lot of writing then, and continued blogging and things like that. And then, yeah, I just kept writing once I graduated, did an MDiv, also a lot of writing with an MDiv. And then my first job out of college was managing the blog of Ed Stetzer. So he's a pretty well-known writer and speaker, and his blog was at Christianity Today. So my first job as an adult when I was 22 was managing a blog at Christianity Today. And so I've never really left it. And I got to do a good bit of writing in that role. And then wrote a blog for a while called Millennial Evangelical, which was about helping older pastors know how to minister to younger, at that point, it was like, here's how to minister to your just graduated from college people. And then dropped that and moved to social media, because a lot of my career has just been kind of based around social media strategy. What is the internet? How can the internet be used for ministry has been much of my career. And so I started writing about deeper things. So I was spending my days scheduling tweets and planning blog strategies. And then in the evenings and weekends, like, what is social media doing to us? And what's our relationship with the internet doing to us? And decided to start writing on that at length. And so around late 2019, early 2020, I started writing about social media and our relationship with it. Neil Postman's book, Amusing Ourselves to Death, was a huge influence toward that end. And then started the official newsletter called Terms of Service that I still write today, around right around the beginning of COVID. So yeah, and then that just developed into 2 books on social media, and here we are. So to give a little bit of preview, not again, I'm going to be done with this in a minute, I promise. I plan to actually probably pause the newsletter soonish. And because I want to try writing fiction. So I'm going to take an indefinite leave from my weekly newsletter and see if I can write a novel or 2 and see if I'm any good at it. And then probably come back to the newsletter later and see if I can actually write some fiction. I've always wanted to try, and so I'd like to give it a shot. So that's my writing life, if anybody cares.
Hey, dude, more power to you. And real quick, when you were at Taylor, I know of Taylor both because of competing against them in soccer when I was at Houghton, but their Silent Night, their basketball Silent Night is like which, just for people, like, it's been featured on like ESPN.
Oh yeah.
And here in Canada, like TSN. So I want to ask, 1, can you give us like a 1 minute, this is what Silent Night is at Taylor University? And 2, did you ever participate? And if so, what character or characters were you dressed up as? Because I hear it's like phenomenal.
Yeah. So I participated in Silent Night all 4 years.
Yeah. Perfect.
I think it started maybe 5 or 6 years before I got to Taylor.
Okay.
And yeah, I participated in Silent Night all 4 years. Here's what it is. Our basketball team, who I'm sure is great, but nobody goes to games. Every year we there's a basketball game scheduled for the Friday before finals week, which is usually December. Yeah, first week of December or so.
Yeah.
And this started in the early 2000s, I think. And the premise is this: the arena's filled. I mean, packed to, especially more today because a lot of people are coming from, since it was starting to be featured on ESPN for the first time when I was there in the
Right.
2010s, 12s time.
Yeah.
And since then, I think a lot of folks come from all over to attend. But back then, all the town would come. Taylor University is in a very small town in Indiana that is very much a college town, but like a town of, I think when Taylor's in session, the population of the town like quadruples.
Yeah.
And so, but like everybody from town comes in, and it's, the gym's always packed to the gills, and you can hardly breathe because it's so hot. And so we all pack in, all the students and everything, and we are totally and completely silent from the time we step into the gym. Most of us get there as soon as class is over, and the gym usually opens a couple hours before the game or whatever. So we'd be in there by 5 or 6, and usually people would go from the dining hall, which is right across the street from the gym, straight over to the gym. And you're totally silent from the time you enter the gym until Taylor University scores their 10th point, at which point, if you want to find this, YouTube, just Taylor Silent Night, you'll find countless videos. And at the 10th point, the entire arena just goes bonkers, and everybody gets up because everybody's been sitting, not even talking to each other. It's not like we're not just cheering. We're not even speaking to each other, just looking at each other, texting each other, making hand signals, whatever. Yeah. And it's, you can hear every squeak. You can hear every timeout and team meeting in those first few minutes, because 10 points only takes 5-7 minutes into the game or whatever. And then everybody just goes bonkers, and like cheering ensues for 5 minutes straight. Usually the other team takes a timeout. These days, I think everybody rushes the court, which wasn't the case most of the time I was there. And then the rest of the game, we're just singing Christmas carols the whole time.
Yeah.
And then we always end by singing Silent Night sometime in the fourth quarter.
Nice.
In the whole arena. And then what's always fun is this part doesn't get any press, but then the president and his wife, historically, I think this is still the case, even though they're on a different president now, have like their huge Christmas party where we all go back to the dining commons and have like this giant Christmas party. And like, it's just a blast. Everybody on campus is there, and it's the most fun day at Taylor every year. And I don't remember what I dressed up as. I was probably just in like Christmas gear, because only some floors and wings, like, communities on campus would have like themes for their attire. The floor that always went nuts was the third floor of my dorm, and they're called the Brotherhood or Broho. And they would always have some totally outlandish like theme where they'd have some dude who was dressed up, as like a gorilla that was in a cage, or what, they'd have some crazy, I mean, they're just known as like the crazy floor on campus. So floors and wings at Taylor kind of have communities like a fraternity does at a college. So Broho would always go nuts. My wife also went to Taylor, and her floor would often do some sort of theme, but I think I was mostly just in like an ugly Christmas sweater or a Santa hat, stuff like that. I think that was my most common sort of attire. Man, I've not been back for Silent Night since I graduated, but I'd love to go back sometime.
You gotta go, man. I just know I've seen I saw the videos when I was at Houghton around the same timeline, and just was like, this is fantastic. So
yeah.
And Taylor's just always had a great reputation for having a really fun fan base. So
yeah,
all that to say, journey down memory lane. But you're also saying, in sharing about your writing journey, that you're interacting with writers like Neil Postman, amusing ourselves to death. You're working for, if people don't know Ed Stetzer, would you describe him as like a cultural critic in some ways? Like, what would you?
Yeah, he would technically say he's a missiologist, but cultural critic. He's as much a cultural critic as he is a missiologist.
Yeah. And well-known speaker and writer in that space. You're working with him on his blog. You're involved in social media strategy at a time when, social media people are starting to discover how impactful and influential social media is and can be, and the repercussions of it. And so I'm just interested, you're inside of that in a real way. Like, it's your job. You're not like plumbing or like, what I'm saying? You're not outside of this. You vocationally, this is like what you do. And as you said, around 2018, 2019, you start to be like, wow, this really is impacting who people are becoming, how they see the world, how they see themselves, how they relate to others. And so to kind of give you a blank canvas to run with on that front, like, what were some of those initial experiences where you're saying, okay, this is what's great about social media. But this is what's actually not so great. And is anybody paying attention to this? What was that like for you initially as you started to wade into what now has been, 2 books and a lot of thoughtful writing on this front?
The first time I really started thinking about the deeper what is social media doing to us was probably around the end of 2016.
Okay.
I was transitioning out of managing Stetzer World because he was leaving Lifeway and going up to Wheaton College, and I was changing roles within Lifeway. So I went to go work for my friend Trevin Wax, who has a column at the Gospel Coalition, and became my boss for a time when we were at Lifeway together. And I was in a position where I was coaching authors on how to use social media more effectively when they weren't publishing books. So an author, if anybody's not aware, like, an author will, when they're publishing a book, will have a marketing manager assigned to them from the
Mm.
publisher who's helping them promote the book, a publicity person who's helping them get interviews, that kind of thing. But it's really on the author to build their audience and build a relationship with their audience in the
Mhm.
time when they're not publishing a book.
Yeah.
A lot of marketing managers on a book project are assigned to it for 6 months or so, maybe a little bit longer. And then they just kind of like, all right, now we're just going to let the book do whatever it's going to do. So an author, when an author first signs a book contract, as an example, or when they are maybe starting to work on a book or something like that, they're a couple years away from publishing that book, but they could already start building their audience. So I had started kind of helping authors who had a lot of potential but weren't very well known,
Mm.
helping them strategically build their audiences on social media in ways that were ethical and like were good strategy and good ethics and like
Yeah.
would work. And so a lot of authors I was working with were either way too active on social media and like I needed to reel them in and be like, hey,
Calm
cool
down.
it.
Yeah.
Yeah. And some of them were like, I don't want to be that first kind of person. So they weren't doing anything. And so I was kind
Mm.
of like standing in the middle, like trying to reel people in and trying to make people jump off the cliff at the same time.
Yep. Yep.
And both were fun to work with and each had their own little idiosyncrasies. But around that time, I had started to study social media a lot just from a big picture perspective. And I was starting to study YouTube a lot because I'd always just seen YouTube until that point as just like a video repository, like a place where you go watch a video and then, you want to fix your refrigerator, go watch a video on how to fix it, or you want to watch some goofy video or like the Harlem Shake trend or something like that. I didn't think of YouTube as a social media platform that like had its
Mm.
own culture and had its own drama, or I just wasn't thinking of YouTube that way. I was not subscribed to a single YouTuber. I was like, why would you want to do that? That just doesn't make any sense to me. Um, but I saw it as a major blind spot in my social media knowledge. And so I was
Mm.
like, I want to just take some time and like study YouTube as a social media platform and have a better understanding of it than I did before. And so I subscribed to like the top 20 YouTubers in the world and just started watching every single video they published,
Mm.
which for many of them at the time, they were posting every day. So
Yeah.
that's when back in this time, the YouTube algorithm was favoring people who posted frequently. So all of these top YouTubers are posting every day. And kind of what I said was like, I want to study these top YouTubers who were playing video games or doing makeup tutorials or doing travel vlogs or whatever else. And I want to see, even though I'm not interested in half of this content, I want to see what all of them are doing the same,
Mm.
despite the fact that their content is all different. Like what's the lowest common denominator here? And I found a handful of trends that I think are still prominent today and are really interesting from a social media strategy perspective. But at the
Yeah.
same time, I started to get an idea for the deeper effects of social media and creator culture and influencer culture and how that was kind of trickling down to like audiences and parasocial relationships, which is when you feel like you're friends with a YouTuber but they don't obviously even know you exist. Like what is
Mm.
that doing to us and
Yeah.
that sort of thing. And so I started to study that stuff a lot more. And then eventually a year or two later, I stopped coaching authors and I became like the head of social media at Lifeway. And
Mm.
so Lifeway Christian Resources at the time was like one of the biggest Christian resource organizations in the world, and all of their 172 stores were still open. So they were one of the biggest Christian retailers in the world.
Right.
Um, and so I was running the at Lifeway social media handles and overseeing the 70 people who were handling all of the other 100 plus social media channels. And so I was in social media 8 hours a day, every day. and on weekends sometimes, unfortunately. And so I was really getting like, I was seeing everything, and was dealing with PR crises left and right, and was, all of that. And that's when I started to be like, man, social media is really affecting people in ways they don't realize, because it was basically my job to pay attention to conversations that were going on social media around our various brands. And
Yeah.
that was a significant portion of my job. And so I started studying that a lot more. And what I realized was just like, I was seeing people I knew personally act in ways that weren't in accordance with who I knew them to be.
Hmm.
And so then I was just like, man, I think this is doing stuff to us. And anybody who's been on social media for any amount of time recognizes some ways that social media can shape you. But what I was particularly interested in was not, a lot of noise is sometimes made about like, hey, watch this, don't watch this, like, don't go to this site, don't watch that, don't, and I think that's all important and good and wise, and we should be careful about the content we consume. But what I became increasingly concerned with over this time, and reading Postman, I think for the first time in 2017, early 2018, was part of what triggered this, was I was like, I feel like we're spending a lot of time focusing on social media and not enough on the social internet. And those two things are different. And the way I describe it is similar to how Postman talks about technology and media, where TV is a technology, like the wires and the screen, that's a technology. That sitcom you watch, or that reality TV show, or that baseball game, or that evening news program, that's all media. That's the culture that's created through that piece of technology. Does that make sense?
Yeah, 100%.
When we talk about the internet, almost all of our conversation is about the media, the content, that funny cat video, that nasty Twitter exchange, that viral YouTube video, whatever. We talk about the content. We don't talk about the technology enough, in my opinion. We don't talk about like, what are algorithms doing to our desires? Like, how much are the recommendation engines that power YouTube and Facebook, how much are they changing our priorities?
Mm-hmm.
I don't think we talk enough about that stuff, because people start to they hear the word algorithm and their brain just turns off. And I think so. I've endeavored to write as much about the technology, the social internet, as I call it, even beyond just social media. Like, oh, Instagram gives people body image issues because they see other pretty people and it makes them feel bad. Yes, that's true. But what is Instagram's recommendation algorithm doing to us? Or what is just like the existence of notifications? How's that rewiring our brain? And like, how's that changing how we devote our attention? Or yeah, that viral video might be kind of distasteful, but like, what makes videos go viral? And why do we seem to assign value? Like, oh, if that went viral, it must be good. Why do we feel that way? Like, why does the going viral matter to us?
Yeah.
So these are the kinds of questions I started to ask. And I realized a lot of the Christian social media stuff I was reading was more about, don't watch this video stuff, watch this video stuff, or don't, Instagram and body image, or like, and that's all good. I just feel like everybody's been beating that drum for a while. And I was like, I think we need some more thought. We need Neil Postman, but Christian and still alive in the internet age.
We need a theology of the social internet.
Yeah. And so I wasn't seeing a ton of that. And so I said, I'm just going to do my best Neil Postman impression if he were a Christian and still alive today. And so that's what I set out to do. And that's kind of Terms of Service, the first book that came out in February of 22, was kind of like meant to be a mirror book. Like, hey, what is social media actually? Like, there's a whole section at the beginning of the book of like a history of the social internet. That's like 90 pages of like, from the first email ever sent all the way to today. Like, how did we get here? Which I thought was going to be the most boring part of the book for people, but I got more good feedback about that than anything else, which is funny. But it was more like a mirror. Like, what is social media doing to me, and what am I supposed to do about it?
Yeah.
A ton of feedback I got from that book was, hey, this is helpful. Can you write something specifically for leaders and pastors, parents, on how to disciple people who seem to be discipled by social media more than anything else? And I said, yeah, you know what? I think there's a need for that. I'm happy to try to write that. And so that's where The Wolf in Their Pockets, this recent book, is meant to be more it's supposed to be less, what is social media doing to me? And more, what is social media doing to the people I lead? And what can I do about that?
Yeah. Yeah.
So
Many good things. I'd love to double click on what you said there, man. But to kind of pull something out of that, what would then you say, okay, yeah, if we are thinking about content on these platforms and not actually how just using these platforms are forming us, what would you say? Okay, be heads up to how the social internet is forming or deforming your sense of identity, your sense of purpose, your sense of this is what really is significant in life. Like you said a minute ago, like what makes a movie go viral, and why is it that if we do something that goes viral, even if it's just me like tripping down my front steps in the morning, why do we say that's so important? You are clearly valuable because you fell on your face and 5 million people watched it. Can you speak to that, those elements of identity and purpose and significance that social media seems to give us so much, have so much to dictate how we see ourselves in light of those things?
Yeah, it's there's so much at play there. And really like the whole book is kind of devoted to that. Even the first book is kind of devoted to that. I think at the heart of a lot of it is the commodification of attention, and like we can measure attention better now than we can have ever been able to measure attention in human history. And like I've said on a number of podcasts and interviews in the last few months, and even when I wrote the first book, that social media is more impactful than the printing press. And a lot of people, especially more like cool, thoughtful people, scoff at that when I say that. And I'm like, dude, I work in publishing. I work for a publisher. I very much value books. I read a lot of books. I've written 2 books, not devaluing the printing press. But imagine if everyone carried a printing press around in their pocket and could share the product of their printing press at the speed of light for free, effectively.
It's revolutionary.
Yeah, like I will die on the hill that the printing press is not as powerful as the internet. It's just not like, it's not comparable. Now, are more important things published through the printing press than through the internet? Well, sure, but that doesn't equate to impact and like influence
and reach.
Yeah, and so it's given us all the ability to be publishers and to be personalities and to be talent, and I think that can't be overstated. Everybody can feel like the main character in the world now. And that creates a sort of myopic, narcissistic self-centeredness, or at least provides fertile soil for such perspective.
You can say
that it makes sort of self-idolatry incredibly hard to resist. Unless you're just going into these platforms solely to be a consumer of content. But for any of us who like to create content, even if we like, I'm not trying to be a full-time influencer, but I still like to tweet or like post Instagram pictures of my dog, you know, like, I can't like, I mean, just think about it. Anybody who's ever posted Instagram, you check your phone way more after you post an Instagram story than if you never posted an Instagram story. And it's not because you're trying to be a professional Instagram influencer, but you just want to see who's looked at my Instagram story and has anybody given me hearts. Like, it's just I've had to use social media more in the last 4 months for promoting this silly book than I ever like to use social media personally. I usually don't have the apps installed on my phone, but I'm trying to be a good author and promote my book, etc. And it's so tempting. It's so easy to just like rationalize being beckoned by my phone to respond to DMs or to post, stories or whatever else to try to get people's attention. And then when I go there, it's like, oh, they're paying attention to me. That must make me valuable. And the only reason we think that is because we have like numbers to assign to it. I've been doing a lot of reading and writing and watching about Mr. Beast lately because I just wrote this really, really long piece, relatively like a 4,000 word piece about Mr. Beast this week on my newsletter. And just like you can just see the value. Like a lot of people love Mr. Beast just because he's the most popular YouTuber, not just because of the content, but because he's the biggest one. There's like a certain value assigned to him in the same way it was assigned to PewDiePie when he was the biggest one. And like, there's just something about, we've come to value fame. This has like always kind of been the case, but like not everybody used to be able to be famous by posting a single video. And that's the case today.
Yeah.
And it's made fame seem so much more appealing and accessible that I think it can make fools out of all of us who try to pursue that.
Yeah.
And it can just make you narcissistic and self-centered. And we can go down the list of all the different things. And there's another thing related to this. The reason this should concern us as Christians is that the best levers to pull to try to become famous through creating content on the internet often run contrary to things that should matter to us as Christians.
It's like tapping into people's
vice
or greed or idolatry.
I could have 10 times the number of Twitter followers I have today if I would just like rail on political people all the time, like on political stuff all the time. Like I have like 2,300 Twitter followers or something like that. Like if I wanted to be Twitter famous, I know exactly how I could do that. Like exactly how I could do that. YouTube, Instagram's a little bit. Oh my gosh. Yeah. That's why, like, that's part of why, like, I've seen friends go down roads on social media and I'm like, that's not who I know you to be. But like, I clearly know what you're trying to do here, because like you're trying to play the game because you know that the best way to win the game is to like be belligerent about politics or whatever on social media.
Yeah.
And you know, that's how you're going to get followers. And I know you really want to publish a book. And so you're going to be able to go to a publisher and say, look at all these followers I have. Like I deal with this on the publisher end where we're like, when we're evaluating a possible author to publish, someone may come in and say, wow, but they've got 30,000 followers on Twitter. I'm like, but do we know how they got those followers? Like, we're not asking enough questions about how people get their followings, because it is often the case, not always, often the case that the way you get the biggest following should disqualify you from publishing Christian content.
Yeah.
So anyway, that's kind of a little bit of a rant, but that's the kind of way it can easily kind of become a self-centered narcissistic enterprise.
Dude, well, to your point, someone sent me, I think it was on Relevant, an article last week about Black China becoming a Christian and getting baptized, and how she was like one of the most successful people on OnlyFans, and like canceled that because she's like, I don't think that's honoring to God. And people are like losing their minds because they're like, you had what we all want, this like massive following, so much attention. But she's tapping on that exactly. She's saying, but it was a really immoral means for gaining that sort of like online traction. And no one's out there saying that. They're just like, you've got millions of people following you. We would kill to have this kind of attention on us on social media. So,
and what's crazy is that's good. I'm all about, if she truly has come to Christ, praise God, I'm all about that. But I think the fact that we even care about a celebrity coming to Christ that way, that is like news, is a sort of fruit of our obsession with fame.
Yeah.
Anyway, it's kind of like when the whole when everything blew up around like Kanye or Bieber in the last few years about like, oh, they're Christians now. I'm like, cool. Have you shared the gospel with your neighbor? Like, so like like I said, rejoice that anybody who has not been a believer has come to faith. But the fact that like that's like headline news is, I think, like a fruit of our obsession with influencer culture.
Yeah, it's fair, because it's like this person was famous for A,
right,
and now they're famous for switching from A to B, and but they're still. It's weird, dude. It's interesting to watch even the famous Christians who deconstruct, and I won't name names, but like even in their deconstruction, it's like they're just pivoting from one form of notoriety, if you will, to another. So that's a great point, Chris.
It's incredible. This is not to I'm not saying that people who have deconstructed / left the faith very publicly online are all doing this, because I don't know their hearts and where they're at. but it is one of the best social media growth strategies today is to be very public about your deconstruction and apostasy. Like, you want to grow a following. One of the fastest ways to grow following on social media today is to loudly trumpet the fact that you are leaving evangelicalism. It is so incredibly profitable to do that.
Wow.
So profitable.
Would not have known that, but I can 100% see how that could be a thing.
Yeah. I'm not saying everybody who's done that is that's their motive.
Right.
I'm just saying, like, it is incredibly profitable to do that.
Yeah. Man. And all that ties into what you were saying earlier about the temptation towards a self-centered or even narcissistic life. And I wonder, Chris, I pulled a couple quotes when I was reading through The Wolf in Their Pockets. And I wanted to read them and then just give you carte blanche to interact with them however you see fit. But both kind of tie into this concept of a sense of godlike power, or like, how can I get people to worship me, or a false sense of I can dictate reality through who I am, how I show up online, and who follows me online. So a couple different quotes. You say, firstly, as the center of visual entertainment has moved from the theater in town to the living room in our homes, i.e. the advent of the television, to the screen in our pockets, the obvious temptation is that the local church would itself become a stage for man-centered performance to the detriment of God-centered worship. And then later on, you say, the ability we have to shape the universe of the social internet, to create, to curate, to cancel, makes us feel godlike. It's putting man obviously at the center of that. So I wonder, could you unpack that, especially through the lens of worship, what we adore, what we long to see people adore in us, and how we believe sometimes that, how we are deceived into believing that that's where the good life is found.
Yeah. I think it's important for us to recognize that our relationship with the internet shapes how we communicate with others beyond just what we do on the internet. And I think it's important that to recognize that it can shape not only what we worship, how we worship, I think can sometimes shape what we worship. And I think the, I don't like railing against people who have like video campuses, so I'm not going to do that. But I think that like the cost of such a thing can sometimes be overlooked. And that sometimes when we have screen mediated worship, it affects how we worship in that way, affects the nature of our worship more than we sometimes realize. And Postman writes a good bit about this in Amusing Ourselves to Death regarding like televangelists and TV preachers, which he was not against Christianity, but he was also not Christian. I think he was Jewish. At least he was Jewish by ethnicity. I don't know if he like actually practiced Judaism, but okay. But he was friendly with Christians and spoke to Christian groups a lot. So he's not coming at televangelists in like a "you're so stupid" kind of way. He's just kind of like, I wonder if televangelists recognize that they're cheapening the message of their gospel by how they're communicating it through the television. And I think there's a lot to be said about that with regard to the internet. And I think one of the biggest concerns I have for the Christian church today in the West, particularly the Americas especially, is consuming in the worship gathering instead of cultivating in the worship gathering. My church is our pastors at our church are very good about pushing back against this. If you're the kind of person who just wants to show up, sing some songs, consume a sermon, say, that's nice, that was insightful, or it made me feel good, and you want to go home, you would be very uncomfortable at my church, like kind of by design. And I think our pastors do a good job of making being a worship gathering consumer uncomfortable and making it more important for us to be cultivators in the worship gathering. And I could talk about what that looks like, and that would be another train
real
of
quick. Well, what does that look like? Just if you're to give a snapshot.
Yeah, it means involving a lot more people in your church service than you typically would. I don't know how my pastors would answer it, but I can say like there are more people in the crowd involved in our worship service than I've ever seen at a church. So like we're a Southern Baptist church technically, but we're pretty liturgical in how we organize our worship service. So like we have an opening scripture reading that somebody in the congregation is just given a card as they're walking into the building, and they go up in front and read it. And then we sing, the band's up singing. We have a time of confession followed by an assurance of pardon, which is also a verse read by somebody who is just handed a card on the way in.
Wow.
We have the reciting of the Apostles' Creed, which has gone back and forth between being led by our worship leader and by people who are asked to go up and lead us in it.
Yeah.
And we have benediction, who's always read by somebody who's given a card as they're walking in. Hey, will you go up at the end and read this?
So you got to be ready.
Yeah. And I think they're pretty good. Like the folks handing out these cards aren't, they pick people who they've seen before. They're not doing this like total newcomers, that kind of thing. Or I'm sure they're giving them to like covenant members of the church is my guess. I don't know. They've never told me how they do it, but I'm guessing they're giving them to members. And also like when everybody does communion differently, but when we do communion, we go get the elements from various tables and then actually circle up and pray with one another and walk through taking the elements together face to face in small groups.
Wow.
So most churches that I've been a part of, you walk in, worship band's playing, especially if you're coming in a minute or two late. They do their thing. You're standing up, hopefully singing along. Somebody will come up and do announcements. You're just still consuming, still listening. You sit down, listen to a nice sermon. You stand back up, listen to a nice song, and you leave. And it's very easy, especially if you incorporate a number of screens in that, to start to consume rather than participate in the worship gathering.
Yeah.
And I think I'm not trying to bash out anybody else's church. I've grew and came to know Christ in many churches that were just like that. So don't hear me bashing that. But I think this just all kind of flows in with like participating in the worship gathering is important, and participating in worship period is important. And the more we mediate our worship through screens, the more our means of worship can fall prey to various ills of the internet in particular, like, oh, well, this new worship song is popular just because it's popular, or because a clip of it went viral on TikTok or whatever. It's like, oh my gosh, is that how we want these things to be? Or this pastor is given a book deal because he had a clip go viral on YouTube, or what, just stuff like this. It happens. Yeah. It really does. And so I think we need to be careful not to let serious matters of faith get caught up in the trends and ebbs and flows of the social internet. And I think a major premise, and I'll stop talking, I promise. A major premise of the book is kind of at the outset that in the introduction, this is kind of a backbone principle that flows through the book, is that I'm not anti-social media, and I want to be very clear about that. I use it personally. TikTok is my current favorite platform. Don't ask me about that. I can explain. I think it can be used for good. However, I think a lot of us use it without thinking. And so I think there are two negative ways we engage social media, postures, if you will. One of them is passive ignorance. This is going to be more common among older folks, people who didn't grow up with social media, and are just kind of like, who cares? That's not real life. It doesn't matter. It's a fad. When I took my first job in social media working for Stetzer back in 2013, a very loving and well-meaning family member said, hey, should you be taking a job in social media? I kind of feel like it's a fad. Like, Facebook's got like 2 billion members. I think we're going to be fine. Yeah. So anyway, like there's a group of people who still think like social media is not a big deal. Don't take it seriously. And I'm like, yeah, sometimes you shouldn't take it seriously, but it is a big deal. That's, I think, an unhealthy posture towards social media and the internet. More commonly, and perhaps more unhealthily, the other unhelpful posture that we have is uncritical embrace, where we just like everything that comes along, we just give it a big old hug, like, oh, new feature on Instagram that requires me to share my location data at all times. Yeah, sign me up. New platform comes out that's all the rage. Yeah, I'll download it and just mess around. Why not? I'm just going to scroll on my phone on Instagram for 2 hours while I watch a movie on Netflix. Like, finally, I'm done looking at my medium-sized screen that I've been looking at all week, so I can look at my small screen while I sit in front of my big screen. Like, that kind of becomes the rhythm of life. And so that's the sort of uncritical embrace. Like, we don't ask any questions of these platforms. We just do whatever we want. We have all the notifications turned on. Somebody liked my story from earlier today. Who liked, I haven't talked to them in forever. Oh, they've got kids now. And then, like, your kids over in the corner, like, hey, can I have a snack? And so, like, that's uncritical embraces. We just kind of let social media happen to us.
Yeah.
I advocate throughout the book and really throughout all of my writing about social media for us to just intentionally engage social media. That's the sort of middle road where even if you don't want to use social media, fine. I'm not telling anybody to create an account. By the grace of God, just don't open that Pandora's box. But, like, if you're a parent who's like, hey, social media is lame and my kid's addicted to it, well, if you don't want to use it, that's fine, but you should at least be aware. Like, read articles about social media, read books about social media. Don't care if they're mine or not. Like, even those of us who don't want to be on the platforms should be aware of the platforms, especially if we're in a position of spiritual leadership.
Yeah.
Be aware of the platforms and how they're affecting the people in your care.
Yeah.
And that can look like intentional engagement, or it can look like I use social media, putting time limits on, having accountability systems set up so you're not a fool and doing foolish stuff. Like, I can't tell you the number of times 5-7 years ago when I was just like posting all kinds of just like dumb stuff on Twitter and like being a jerk, that I'd have friends be like, hey, stop it. You're being a jerk. Like, I know that's not who you are. Stop it.
Yeah.
And you need to have people like that who can just call you out. And a lot of us just don't think about social that way. And so anyway, that's a lot of what runs through the book. And I think we can let that affect our worship too if we're not careful.
Yeah. So to double click a little bit on that piece of just like, be intentional. Don't just treat it as a fad that is like, whatever. Don't just mindlessly consume it. Don't let it absorb all your worship. To go one step beyond that, to the place of then, okay, as you're engaging with this, realize you've got just a glut of information coming at you. You've got like deep fakes showing up. You've got people who are, positioning themselves as experts in this, that, or the other, saying that they, their perspective is the perspective. And then sometimes, ironically, having somebody who actually is educated in that space, whether it's politics or medicine or education, being like, this person's nuts. What my point is, we see so many, conspiracy theories, trolls, internet crusaders coming across everyday feeds. How do we have discernment? How do we engage with that in a way that is really wise and doesn't let us get sucked into the wrong kind of content and the wrong kind of online communities?
So how I would answer that's really hard. It can be very hard to discern that. And what I would say is, I had to deal with this a lot, especially when I was leading social media at Lifeway. We would get a ton of complaints and I had to discern, like, is this a well-meaning person who's like, hey, why do you carry this resource? I don't think it's theologically, aligned with you and what you should be publishing or carrying. Or is it somebody who just like doesn't agree with us and they're just being mean, or whatever? That was a common occurrence when I was having to run social at Lifeway, was kind of discerning like who's a troll and who's a well-meaning critic.
Right.
That's just like one example of this. And you have to do your best. And a lot of this is just kind of like internet literacy. You have to do your best to figure out like tone, even though it can be hard to read that, and figure out where the person's coming from. So I don't like using my life experience all the time, but it's really the best example. It's just like, when somebody would come at us on the Lifeway handle, for instance, the first thing I would do when I saw like their critique of us was first evaluate like, okay, are they being mean here? Right. Are they saying like, hey, I don't think you should carry this product. Here's a link to what it is. Or are they saying like, of course you're carrying this trash. Da, da, da. Okay, clearly like either they just don't agree with us, or maybe the book, maybe I don't even like that we carry that book. But the fact that they just like came at me saying like, I can't believe, or of course you would carry this trash book, da, 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 then like, okay, I might examine this issue and even run it up the flagpole of like, hey, should we be carrying this? I've been getting a complaint about it on Twitter. But I'm not going to like dignify that with a response, because like that person clearly is not interested in having a civil conversation.
Right.
However, and this happened a lot, and this is where I ran into the most resistance in that role, is like we would have people come at us who would be respectful and would be like, hey, I don't think you should carry this resource or partner with this speaker or whatever else. And they weren't being jerks, and they weren't being, trolly. They weren't calling us names. Or I mean, you wouldn't believe the number of people I saw cussing us out because we carried more versions than the KJV. It's like,
how do you swear in KJV?
Yeah, right. Thusly, yeah, no, like the fact that you're literally cussing us out for not exclusively carrying your version of the Bible. I'm seeing a misalignment here. So anyway, but like that kind of thing happened. But the hardest ones were like people who would come at us with like what I would view as legitimate critiques, even if I disagreed with them. They're being respectful, they're being even kind, and they're just trying to like voice a concern that they think we should be aware of. I would often respond to those people and like say, hey, we're looking into this, we'll get back with you. And then we would provide a sort of response or like whatever. But it all of that's to say is, because I'm assuming a lot of people aren't in positions, in those some similar roles. But if you're a pastor or whatever else, you might deal with that kind of stuff, from church members or people who visit your church or things like that. And I think looking at tone is important, because it's never wise to engage a troll, never, unless you want to engage them by saying, if you're a pastor or something like that, and someone's like, I went to this church this weekend and they were all super mean to me or whatever. They're like, hey, we'd love to talk to you about your experience. We're sorry you feel that way. Would you call our church number or stop by? Or
yeah,
the what I found often in whether it's resolving conflict or dealing with people who are acting a fool like that, is try to take it offline as soon as possible.
Right.
At least take it private, if not offline, and handle conflict that way. Because as long as you're handling conflict publicly, everybody's performing for an audience.
Yeah.
And so, but beyond that, like, I just, without being cynical or having a negative view of people, if I see something online, like a claim or a, conspiracy theory potentially, or, whatever, I'm going to look into this person and what else they're posting. Do they seem like a rational person? I'm going to do my own research about the topic at hand. I mean, when I was writing this book, the number one thing, I was talking to about 24 pastors throughout the writing of the book, and the number one topic they said that they wanted addressed was conspiracy theories and discernment. And so I have an entire chapter devoted to discernment and to conspiracy theories, because it's, even though conspiracy theories is kind of a subset, it demanded its own chapter. And so when it comes to that, like, I do my own research and like, okay, this person made this claim and like, that kind of sounds logical, but it doesn't jive with what I think about when I saw this. And so I'll go do some research. And so it's hard to say. I try to give some more advice in the book, but best thing to do is just don't believe anything you read on the internet. Don't assume poorly of people, but don't believe anything until you've corroborated it with like other trustworthy sources.
Yeah, that's a good word.
Yeah.
Well, Chris, I'd love to fire one more question your way before we wrap things up, but
yeah,
just appreciating your sharing so much on the front of, how social media forms us towards being the hero of our own stories and wanting to be the hero of everyone else's stories, having people follow us. The implications of that, as we talked about a few minutes ago, for worship, and then you just giving some great counsel when it comes to discernment. And so I wonder, could you just leave us with what would be your insights on then how to cultivate humility? I know that in the book you say that you define humility as knowing who I am in light of who God is. And I feel that in the midst of everything that's coming at every user of social media and people engaging with the social internet, that the gift of the character quality of humility is such a great quality to bring to those platforms, to those considerations. And so can you unpack that quote for us a little bit as we consider who we should be becoming as we use social media, knowing who I am in light of who God is?
Yeah. One of the best things my youth pastor ever did when I was in high school was teach us what various Christian terms meant because I grew up in church, and I don't think I really became a believer until later in high school. But um, yeah, I grew up hearing terms like grace and mercy, which I thought were like the same thing, and sanctification and all of these various terms. And some of them I kind of suss out what they meant, and some of them, like grace and mercy, I just misunderstood as being the same thing. Um, and one of the terms he defined for us was humility. I think we had like a whole series, and I've since done this with the youth group that I help lead, do a whole series on like Christianese or whatever, on these various terms. And humility, he defined, he's the one who first heard that definition from, or that little quip. I don't know where he got it even, but humility is knowing who I am in light of who God is. And that's helpful for me because often, and some folks listening may even think this, but humility is kind of seen as like hating yourself or thinking badly of yourself or whatever. Like, oh, I'm such a terrible person. Like, oh, you're so humble. Severe. Yeah. Like, or, oh man, I'm just not good. Like, I'm not a good person. Oh, you're so humble. Well, kind of. And like, yeah, you're not a good person, but humility, you can be super prideful in thinking about yourself a lot, even if you think about yourself a lot poorly. Right. I forget who said it, but it's like, I can't even remember the quote exactly, but humility is not thinking less of yourself. It's thinking of yourself less. I don't know who that is. C.S. Lewis. Yeah. I was going to ascribe it to Lewis, but like everything's ascribed to Lewis. So right. It's either Lewis or Twain or Spurgeon, one of the three. I don't know. And so they wrote half the words that exist in the human language, it feels like. So like the human language, I just said, in the English language, there are multiple languages. So Lewis says that. I think so that's kind of where I got the definition, was from my youth pastor, that humility is knowing who I am in light of who God is, because it's not thinking of yourself poorly. It's just having a right understanding of who you are in relation to God. So humility can be seen as, I'm a child of God. I'm also a sinner, redeemed by grace, but I'm not free from the bonds of sin entirely. I'm affected by the brokenness of the world. I know what's right, and I know what I want to do, but I often do what I don't want to do. And it's like having a healthy recognition of, I just think it's always helpful to look at ourselves less in relation to other people, which is often the temptation when it comes to humility, and think of ourselves in relation to God, which sometimes can make you feel even worse. But when you remember the grace and mercy and love of God, you can be reminded that even in your humility and the brokenness you think of in your humility, you are still saved and loved by God who loves you. A part of humility is knowing that you're a son or daughter of the King of the universe. And so anyway, that's where that comes from. And I think for us, when it comes to social media, it's really tempting to think you're the main character of not only your story, but of everyone's story, and that other people play bit parts in your world. And that's just like only natural. I think I have a quote from David Foster Wallace in there where it's like, yeah, it's only natural because you can only see from your pair of eyeballs, and you can only experience life as it happens to you. I don't even know that it's like an effect of sin. It's just like the effect of living your life. It makes you feel like everything that happens to you has more weight than things that happen to someone else, because you're you and they're them, and whatever. But I think social media can so exacerbate that to where you can say, well look, these 5,000 people clearly care about my life because they follow me on Instagram. Oh, you've got 500 people following you on Instagram. Clearly I'm more important than you are.
Right.
No one's going to say that, but there can be an implication of that. Right. Yeah. And so I think for us, as we use social media, like, we have to recognize that as tempting as it can become to see ourselves as the center of our own story, and even perhaps the center of other people's story or stories, we have to remember that we are just characters in the ultimate redemptive story of God in the universe, and the arc that he is creating over the course of eternity past to eternity future. And it's just never, I feel like I could be living in the moment here, but I feel like it's never been easier to be an incredibly prideful person and to be a narcissist. Like, it's never been easier to be a narcissist, because it's never been easier to quantify how much people care about you. And I think as Christians, not wrong it's not wrong for a Christian to even want to be an influencer. I don't think there's anything implicitly wrong with that. But I think there are some pitfalls that are often overlooked, either because this is still so new or just because our sin blinds us to these pitfalls that we should be aware of anytime we want to post something. Like, why am I posting it? What am I looking for? What kind of affirmation am I looking for? Am I looking for people to tell me something about myself that I want to feel, but I don't feel? Are we looking to functionally serve other people as our function, as our God, or are we looking for them to worship us as theirs? Like, I think I can't recommend this because it's horrible and vulgar, but I'm going to make people aware of the existence of Bo Burnham's in documentary called Inside, which is on Netflix, and I would not recommend you watch, but I'm going to recommend to you knowing existing. Bo Burnham's documentary Inside, which he wrote, recorded, edited, directed all himself. He's a comedian. I don't know if you've ever heard of this guy. His special Inside, which is theoretically a comedy special, was posted to Netflix, like published whatever on Netflix in early 2021, May of 2021, when we were coming sort of out of the pandemic for the first time in some respects. And he unpacks, frankly, in there a lot of this kind of thing. Now, he's not a Christian, and like I've said, it is quite vulgar at parts, but he talks with serious depth, better than most Christians I've heard talk about the allure of so many of these things that we've talked about. And so it's a human thing. Yeah. It's not just a Christian identification of sin in our world thing. We are not exempt from this. And I think we need to recognize that when we are more aware of who we are in light of who God is, we're less likely to think so highly of ourselves with regard to social media.
Man, that's the perfect way to land the plane. I wonder for people listening in, if they want to learn more about your work, Chris, or connect with you online, or just pick up a copy of The Wolf in Their Pockets, how can they do that?
Yeah, so I'm on Twitter at ChrisMartin17. I'm not particularly active there. I just tweet out links that I read and things like that. So, but you can find my newsletter there. Like I said, I often tweet out links of things that I'm reading. So if you want some good articles on social media or whatever, I'm tweeting things there. I'm on Instagram at ChrisMartin17 as well. But again, I post stories from time to time and otherwise don't do a whole lot. But my newsletter is termsofservice.social, which you can find, and delivers every Tuesday is a original piece of writing, and every Thursday is kind of a collection of links. Like, here's what I've been reading. Yeah. And then my book, anywhere you want to buy books, you should be able to find it. So The Wolf in Their Pockets, and then Terms of Service is still available. I think they still publish that book. I don't think it's out of print yet. So you can find both of those someplace, I'm sure.
Right on, man. Well, thank you, Chris. Grateful for you, grateful for your work, and grateful for what you've shared with our listeners today.
Yeah, thanks for having me, man.